I'm here with someone I met several years ago who I've always been impressed by his ideas of where aging and gerontology and the field of aging is heading, especially in the Portland area. Jay Bloom is someone who knows what's happened in Portland over the years, knows what is happening, and he has some ideas on what might be happening. So Jay, thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
The current business that Jay works with in consulting is called Bloom Anew, perfect for a person named Jay Bloom. And Jay, how long has Bloom Anew been available for people to use as a resource?
Well, I'd have to go back with a little bit of personal history or work history. I did undergraduate and graduate work in psychology in Massachusetts. I went to the only place that Sigmund Freud lectured in America,
Really?
Clark University, and
Okay.
in Worcester, Mass. There are pictures of him and Alfred Adler and Carl Jung all around the campus. And the first president of Clark, interesting enough, his name is G. Stanley Hall. And he's famous not so much for being the first president of Clark, but he was the one who coined the phrase or the whole stage of life adolescence, which I'll circle back later in
Now,
our
did you
conversation.
choose Clark College specifically
Clark
for
University.
Clark University for
Psychology.
the
yeah.
richness of what it had?
Yeah,
Wow.
I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa, and growing up in rural area, you're never really exposed to psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. The human dilemmas of life tend to revolve around the church, and so initially I thought I was going to go into the ministry, and had a seminary picked out in Chicago.
And
But as
what was the name of the town?
it was Albert City was the name
And how
of it.
big? How big?
Oh, it was probably about 300 people.
Okay,
300
keep going.
people. And as I got a little older, in high school, I got less interested in the formality of religion, but was still interested in what makes people tick. And so my father and mother and the family moved to Connecticut when I was a junior in high school, middle of my junior in high school, to a town right outside of New Haven. And at that time, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, and so I did an early decision to go to Clark University in Worcester because it had a very strong psychology program. I then subsequently went to graduate school in psychology and thought I was going to be a therapist. And shortly after graduate school, after working a couple of years in the field, I got into the management of nonprofits, and found that I enjoyed that. As I said, I counseled the counselors and was the
Okay.
director of an organization in Massachusetts from 1975 to 81. In 1981, I moved down to Connecticut, New London, Mystic, Connecticut.
Still working in the nonprofit field.
Still working in the nonprofit field, and headed up a family service organization there that was a large provider of employee assistance programs. And when I say large, we had about 30,000 employees under contract. And the way EAPs work is you pay per head per month.
EAP. What's an EAP?
Employee assistance program is an employer benefit that is most organizations today have, governmental, private sector, even nonprofits.
So back then you were breaking new ground on having
Yeah, it was early. The history of employee assistance programs came out of kind of the corporate world when they were struggling with alcoholism
Okay.
in the workplace.
Okay.
And what ends up happening for managers in organizations that don't have employee assistance programs is they're left with two very, let's say, unsuccessful approaches if someone presents a personal problem. So if an employee presents an issue around a divorce or a substance abuse issue, or I'm having trouble with my child, if a supervisor doesn't have an employee assistance program, they're left with these two choices. One would be either to try to problem solve, in which case they become amateur psychologists, and most of them aren't
that
trained.
can do more harm than good sometimes.
Do more harm than good. And in many cases now you've got an impaired employee and now an impaired supervisor. The other approach is, if you don't have an employee assistance program, is that you ignore the problem and often human dilemmas go from bad to worse. So what an employee assistance program offers for an employer and that manager is a tool that says, you know, Roger, I'm sorry to hear about your personal dilemma, but you may not be aware that we have this confidential, voluntary, and free resource called Employee Assistance Program that you may want to take advantage of. In the meantime, I want to focus on your job performance. And so we had about 30,000 employees under contract, ranging from banks to Connecticut College to Pfizer, General Dynamics.
And you were helping shape the program as it was being developed. So your guidance was your background in psychology, but also that's a fairly new field back then as far as getting a problem solved, but focusing on the performance. And later, we're going to be talking about caregivers, maybe the equivalent now of in need of the same type of safe island or assistance. But keep going.
So anyway, what happened in the 80s is the heads of those organizations were more than willing to send their employees to see my employees. But when they wanted service, they would call me up.
Okay.
And essentially it's the issue, the higher you go up in an organization, the more isolated you are and who you can talk to. And since they had prepaid the benefit, they wanted to talk with the CEO, and in that case was with me. And this was before there was anything called executive coaching. And so in the 80s, I referred to as executive assistants. And for the most part, there were issues around transition. Do I want to keep doing what I'm doing? Do I want to relocate? Do I want to retire? And if they had a spouse or partner, they were often reluctant to want to, they had a vested interest in that. So rather than just struggle with those issues alone, they would reach out to me. When I was
so once again, I saw this when I first talked to you about who are you and where did you come from. I was so fascinated with the fact that you saw fields that were in need of some organization or structure, and you didn't wait for somebody else to create it. You're creating what was really the earliest that I can have heard of, earliest coaching of executives, because they have problems too. No better or worse, just different from the new employees.
So when I came out to Oregon in 1993, recruited to head up an organization called Morrison Child and Family Services. By that time, you'd heard that term, executive coaching.
Okay.
And so I built into my employment contract the capacity to do that on the side. And that's when I launched the Bloom Anew, which is your original question.
And that was about when?
1993.
93. So
93.
For the last over 20 years, you've been a consultant with lots of different areas that you can then use your skills.
Yeah, it was very part-time while I was running the Morrison, because it was a very large organization, but kept it up. And so what I like to say is I've been doing executive coaching long before it had a name, 30 years. So if you were to look at streams that led me up till now, one stream was kind of a spiritual one when I was in junior high and high school, very active in a Swedish Lutheran church and was always kind of interested in meaning. Second was in psychology. My focus was on adult development when I was in college, graduate school 40 years ago. A third stream would be, over 35 years of being an executive of nonprofit organizations. And then the fourth stream that we just touched on is over 30 years as an executive coach, working with folks going through change. So those are the variety of streams. And probably the only other one to touch on is I've had a strong involvement in social justice for a lot of years, which continues to this day.
And we'll get into that in a few minutes. Jay, we're going to take a break. This is called a brain break, and you and I have talked a little bit about those, and so the students will be back with us after they stretch, and you and I stretch a bit.
Okay.